Our final speaker before we march to Nancy Pelosi's office is Norman Solomon. He's a prolific media critic, a journalist, and the founder of the Institute for Public Accuracy. He works and writes tirelessly for reliable, spin-free American media. You may have read one of the dozen books he's written in critique of media bias, war in Iraq, and corporate culture. He's also a longtime political activist, first coming under FBI scrutiny at the age of just 14, after picketing for desegregation in Maryland in the 1960s. As a high school senior, he drew further FBI surveillance for his efforts on behalf of the Student Alliance activist group. Recently authoring an op-ed asserting that Bradley Manning deserves the Nobel Peace Prize, he's an outspoken champion of whistleblowers and a huge inspiration for activists everywhere. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Norman Solomon.
Well, back in civics class, we heard that in a democracy, there has to be consent of the governed, right? Now, how can consent of the governed really function if we, the governed, don't know what our government is really doing, right? So, for consent of the governed to mean anything, it has to be informed consent of the governed, right? But the entire process of the surveillance state and the war on whistleblowers is to say, you don't have a right to know what your government is doing. We know that that is BS, right? Now, today in the Guardian newspaper, Glenn Greenwald has reported that almost every member of Congress doesn't have a clue what the NSA is doing in terms of surveillance. How can that be in a democracy? It cannot be in a democracy, am I right? And so you take it another step further. You and me and the residents of this country, if we can't participate in informed consent of the governed, then we can't have a democracy. But it's even worse than that. Almost everybody we elect and send to Congress, they don't have a clue either. Or they claim they don't have a clue. And then we have people on the so-called Intelligence Committee, and, you know, it's sort of like what George Carlin said about jumbo shrimp, military intelligence. We put scare quote marks around intelligence, but they call it the House and Senate Intelligence Committees, right? Only certain members of the House and Senate are allowed on those committees. That's because they have to be trusted and show that they're willing not to be honest with the American people. And that is unacceptable. I'd like to quote something that the great abolitionist Frederick Douglass said back in the 19th century. Power does not concede without a demand. It never did, and it never will. That was true in the 19th century, and it's true today. That puts on us a tremendous burden, but it's a necessary burden. We have understandably sometimes had a negative connotation in our own minds and hearts with the concept of power, because we experience power as coming from on high, illegitimate, undemocratic, and so when we talk about power, often we get uneasy. But there's another kind of power that isn't illegitimate, that doesn't come from up above, that isn't dictatorial, that isn't based on the warfare state and the military state and the surveillance state. And that is something that's been called the power of the people. That's where democracy comes from. That's where our potential is, and that's why we and people around the country are rallying and protesting today to say we refuse to accept the surveillance state. So many people around this country understand today more than ever that the First Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, the Fifth Amendment are sacred, and we're not going to put up with our government trashing the Bill of Rights. People around this country understand that, but not Nancy Pelosi. People around this country understand that when you have a surveillance state like the Stasi in East Germany in past decades, that is antithetical to democracy. People around this country more and more understand that, but not Nancy Pelosi. People understand around this country more and more that as long as the president and the heads of these committees and the top echelon of government can double talk and triple talk and quadruple talk and talk around the fact that our rights, such as the Fourth Amendment, are being squashed by agencies like the NSA, then we don't have any semblance of democracy. People understand that more and more, but not. Why is that so important? It's not only because we're here in San Francisco. It's not only because Nancy Pelosi represents this district in the U.S. House of Representatives. It's also because, as Foreign Policy Magazine reported last week, the one individual in Washington, D.C. who had the most effect on the defeat of the necessary Amash-Conyers Amendment to shut down this unfair, undemocratic surveillance from the NSA, the one person who had the most effect to preserve the surveillance state vote was Congresswoman Nancy Pelosi. It's so important that, and I'm going to reference again what Frederick Douglass said, that power be taken by people who refuse to accept it in undemocratic forms. That's why in a couple of minutes we're going to begin to march. That's why in a couple of minutes we're going to begin to march on the office of Nancy Pelosi, the biggest enemy of democracy right now in this country. Now, sometimes, and this will be my closing thought to share with you today, sometimes people will tell us, you know, you just got to be in the streets. Forget about the elections. And other people will tell us, you just got to work on the elections. Forget about being in the streets. That's like saying, do you want to eat or do you want to drink? Do you want to breathe or do you want to sleep? It's absolutely essential to build our movement to protect the Bill of Rights, that we are in the streets and we are in the elections and we're struggling for power because that's essential for our futures. And on that note, I want to say, here in the center, in the heart of the district of the most powerful surveillance state member of Congress, we serve notice on Nancy Pelosi today that you have thrown down a gauntlet, and we are picking it up. We do not accept your leadership. Your free ride is over. You do not deserve to represent us anymore.
All right, let's give a big hand to all our speakers. In 5 minutes or so, we are going to start marching right down Market and hand deliver our message to Nancy Pelosi herself. And so stay until then, we'll let you know when we start.